Hi ladies and gents, tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams, to a place where sandals slap stone floors, candles flicker low, and the only real drama is whether Brother Oswin remembered to feed the scriptorium cat. Welcome, dear dreamer, to the quietly thrilling world of medieval monks, where silence is golden, the robes are itchy, and excitement involves successfully bottling mead. Before your eyelids press themselves like vellum in a monastic bookbinding room, go ahead and press that like button. It may be your only rebellious act all day. Let us begin. The year is something thoroughly medieval, say 1132 AD. The place is northern England, in the fog-soft cradle of the Yorkshire Ridges. Nestled in a river bend like a sleepy otter, sits the priory of St. Mumble of the mildly important, a modest Benedictine monastery lovingly ignored by kings and feared only by nearby drinkers who occasionally stumble into its library looking for ale and find only psalms. Life here begins not with a bang, heavens no, but with a bell, a slow, deliberate tung of iron echoing across dew-clad cloisters just before dawn. This sacred clamour, called the Matin's bell, is the medieval version of an alarm clock you can't throw across the room. Monks rise in silence, slipping from their straw-stuffed pallets like shuffling ghosts in wool. There is no grumbling. That would be prideful. Also that would be heard. Brother Ethelbert, a small man with large feet, swings them over the edge of his bed and quietly regrets having knees. He is 43, a seasoned age for a monk, and positively ancient for someone who still occasionally bumps his cowl into door frames. He murmurs a soft prayer. Lord, grant me strength to chant the antiphons without yawning audibly. The others rise in a hush, moving single file through stone corridors lit by sputtering oil lamps. Their footfalls whisper past faded frescoes depicting saints with expressionless faces and surprisingly defined abs. At the choir stalls, they gather like murmuring bees ready to begin the divine office. This is not church in the way your Aunt Susan means it. This is a schedule of prayer sessions so numerous, they make modern meetings look casual. Matins is first, then comes Lord's, because one prayer meeting before sunrise simply won't do if you're aiming for holiness. The psalms are chanted in Latin, with melody as steady and soothing as hot honey slipping off a spoon. Some monks, such as Brother Yetwin, may drift momentarily, head nodding like a contemplative sunflower. After these pre-dawn praises, it's time for a deeply medieval breakfast. Porridge, deep vats of it, not so much eaten as endured. Sometimes it's oats, sometimes barley, and once, in a culinary scandal never spoken of, Brother Lurg tried millet. As they eat, conversations remain off limits. Monasteries like St. Mumble's observe the Great Silence, which lasts from the end of night prayers until morning work begins. Instead of words, monks communicate with a series of approved hand signals, allowing them to express urgent sentiments like, "Pass the turnips," or "I can't feel my feet." It is rather like attending a dinner party for highly literate mimes. Meals are taken in the refectory, a cold stone hall smelling faintly of cabbage, candle wax, and centuries-old sanctity. As they eat, one monk, usually the poor soul who drew the short straw, stands at a lectern reading aloud from the Rule of St. Benedict, or Lives of the Saints. Saints, it must be said, led very dramatic lives. One was boiled alive. Another walked hundreds of miles barefoot because he misplaced his sandals in a vision. This makes the porridge go down faster. Once breakfast concludes, the monks rise in sync. Their chores await. And oh, the chores. Monastic life is less a spiritual retreat and more a medieval group project in agriculture, manuscript management, and soap-adjacent cleanliness. Brother Ethelbert pulls on his thick hood and trudges toward the herb garden, which smells of thyme and pious dirt. Brother Osmond heads to the scriptorium, where ink is sacred, and even sneezing near vellum could result in a 1,000-yard stare from the head scribe. And Brother Alric, expert in brewing, inspects yesterday's ale while murmuring that most Benedictine of blessings: deliver us from overly hoppy batches. As their day unfolds, hour by quiet hour, a deeply cozy rhythm forms. Here, where the modern world's buzz cannot enter, monks work, chant, and occasionally pester each other with small, saintly acts of passive aggression, like correcting Latin grammar mid-psalm. But now, dear listener, night dims the cloister once again. The bell has not yet tolled for Compline, but the wind brushes through arched corridors like a lullaby. Settle in, 10 toes under your blanket, as we ready ourselves to examine what comes next in the winding, candle-lit passages of monastic life. Chapter 2: Dawn Bells and Cold Floors. In the deeper folds of night, somewhere beneath star-pebbled skies and the quiet breath of old timbered roofs, a bell rings. Not a loud ring, more of a groggy clank, echoing softly from a lone tower where a monk with frosty eyebrows pulls a rope with ancient conviction. It is still dark. Everything is still dark. The year is 1137, and in a Benedictine monastery nestled between rain-drenched hills, the day is beginning. Monastery mornings began with a ritual known as matins, followed by lauds. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. That's not 2 monks, that's 2 church services. The bell you just imagined clinking through the gloom? That's the matins bell. Its job is to rouse a collection of very sleepy, very wool-blanketed men from their straw-stuffed mattresses. Of course, these mattresses weren't exactly plush. A roughly built wooden frame, a little sack of hay, maybe a blanket woven out of God's finest sheep, probably the itchy kind, and a pillow if you were unusually beloved by your fellow brethren. Warmth, if you had it, came not from insulation, but optimism. Under the rule of St. Benedict, a sort of early medieval self-help guide with less yoga and more fasting, the monks were required to rise for prayer in the 4th watch. Now, if you're not fluent in Roman timekeeping, that translates to yawningly early, most likely between 2 and 3 a.m., which is a time normally reserved for owls, poets, and people making questionable snack-related decisions. Picture Brother Ethelred. He's not famous. He looks, frankly, like every other monk wrapped in a brown cowled robe and mild regret. He stirs from sleep, hears the bell, and sighs one of those small inward sighs that anyone who's ever had to set an early alarm knows quite well. His feet meet the cold stone floor with a wind so spiritual it almost counts as a prayer. There's no talking, not because they aren't allowed to speak yet, though, spoiler alert, silence is kind of a thing, but because what exactly would one say at 2:37 a.m. with no coffee in sight? The brothers shuffle, candle in hand, forming a sleepy procession through echoing cloisters. Soft footfalls, an occasional sneeze, a yawn that tries to disguise itself as a sigh. This is how they greet the new day. In the dim light of the chapel, things feel sacred and chilly, and sacred. The candles flicker on statues of saints who presumably never had to wake up this early. The chants begin, plainchant to be precise. Think Gregorian but slightly more medieval and slightly less catchy. It's smooth, monotone, almost like an incantation, but the soothing kind, as if the very act of prayer could lull the day into being gently, with reverence and just a little dramatic flair. This goes on for about an hour, maybe 2, if the prior is feeling particularly pious or just couldn't sleep. After Lauds, once the first blurry brushstrokes of dawn creep across the horizon, a mild sense of survival settles in. The monks file out quietly, minds partly uplifted, partly wondering when breakfast is. But breakfasts, in monasteries, aren't exactly the champagne brunches of medieval life. No mimosa carts, not even a decent croissant. Depending on the region and strictness of the order, breakfast could be a slice of coarse bread, maybe a dab of onion, and on the really exciting days, a boiled turnip. Lavish feasts were for saints' days and nobility. Everyday sustenance was meant to be humble, fuel for the spirit, not the waistline. Still, the monks cherished routine. And at this liminal hour, between prayer and porridge, between star and rising sun, there was a peculiar rhythm to their world. It was quiet authority, sacred repetition. Some would say it was dull, but dullness has its own gentle purpose. In the silence of habit, clarity often hides. Now, while Brother Ethelred carefully sips from a wooden cup filled with watered ale, yes, that was a thing, safer than water, oddly enough. He glances out at the courtyard. The dew still clings to every blade of grass like jewels, though he is unimpressed by this metaphor because metaphors haven't been invented yet. Around him, the others begin their daily tasks, gardening, copying manuscripts, or tending to the scriptorium geese, who we'll meet later. But before we move forward, take a deep breath. Inhale the scent of damp parchment and simple stew, and exhale whatever modern nonsense has been bothering your spirit today. The monks have just begun their day, and there is much more monotony to embrace. But for now, let your mind linger beneath the stone archways, where footsteps echo like whispers, and time itself seems content to walk in circles. Chapter 3 of Spoons, Silence and Supper. In the hushed halls of the medieval monastery, where the wind sighed through cloisters and sandals scuffed softly over worn flagstones, dinner time arrived not with a bang, but a most profound silence. Now, dinner, or as they like to call it, refectory time, was no boisterous feast. There were no turkey legs waved triumphantly in the air, no sloshing goblets of mead, and no lute player in the corner serenading a wheel of cheese. No, this was a time steeped in discipline and dietary restraint. Monks were, you see, spectacularly solemn about their soup. Imagine it. A simple stone hall lined with long wooden tables. Candles flicker along the nave, casting sleepy golden halos over steaming pottages and crumbly loaves. The monks file in like clockwork cogs, each clad in scratchy wool, with their dinner tools, namely a wooden spoon and an earthenware bowl, both lovingly unadorned. Here's the part that dreams are made of. No one speaks. The rule of Saint Benedict, that ancient beacon of monastic life, prescribed silence during meals, unless you were the one reading scripture aloud, and even then, only if appointed. Chit-chat was as forbidden as flamboyant seasoning. Instead of conversation, language during dinner consisted largely of shy glances, the soft clinking of zuppa against spoons, and the occasional sneeze which, regrettably, was usually met with mournful stares, rather than bless yous. Gesture language developed. A rich tapestry of subtle hand signals that could mean please pass the bread, or you stole my turnips yesterday, Brother Barnabas. Meals typically featured the kind of food ideal for living simply and digesting slowly. The monks enjoyed lentils, onions, leeks, peas and beans. So many beans, For centuries, beans were the gastronomic backbone of cloistered cuisine, much to the consternation of those sharing dormitories afterward. On fasting days, and there were many, they might skip meat altogether, though to be fair, many monasteries avoided meat on the regular anyway. Fish and eggs could make an appearance, but only if it wasn't a penitential season. You'd think they'd be skinny with such sparse menus, but as it turns out, cutting out frivolous modern activities like jogging and CrossFit meant they got along just fine. The brother assigned to serve the food, often called the refectorian, had the unenviable honour of carrying pot after steaming pot of humble fare from the kitchen to the dining hall. With each ladling of parsnip stew, he performed something close to a sacred rite, ladling nourishment into bowls with a kind of pious precision that can only be cultivated by years of near-constant root vegetables. Despite the culinary monotony, or maybe because of it, mealtime was sacred, not just by religious standards, but by the standards of pacing one's day. Imagine trudging through prayer, copying sermons, and illuminating manuscripts by firelight until your stomach announces its rebellion, like a Gregorian chant in your abdomen. That first bite of turnip gruel? Exquisite. Now, should a monk sneeze in his soup, or heaven forbid, drop his bread on the cold stone floor, he offered no witty remark or lamentation. He simply bowed, picked up the bread quietly, dusted it off with a brush of sincere contrition, and continued as though it hadn't tasted a bit of medieval shoe. At the head of the table sat the abbot, not so much regal as reverently constipated looking from years of spiritual leadership and legumes. His presence reminded everyone that this meal was not for bodily indulgence, but for the nourishment of souls and stomachs, just perhaps in reverse order depending on the day. Occasionally, special feast days brought a delightful surprise, where perhaps honey-spiced apples or a bit of hard cheese would appear on a wooden platter. On such days, the monks' eyes widened almost imperceptibly, and their chewing slowed with reverence. This was the medieval equivalent of a Michelin star experience, except served on a wooden plank and rated holy rather than haughty. As the last morsel vanished and candles dwindled into pools of waxy halos, the monks rose with practiced synchronicity, placing their bowls just so, spoons aligned like relics of reverent routine. Not a whisper passed between them, though every rumbling stomach and contented sigh told volumes louder than words. And so, with bellies full of piety and pottage, the brothers drifted toward vespers and eventually their straw-stuffed mattresses beneath the crook of ancient beams. For tomorrow, after all, would come again, with more silence, more soup, and perhaps, if fortunes allowed, a lentil not entirely overcooked. We'll rest now, as the monks did, gently in silence, warmed not just by stew, but by ritual itself. As syllables drift into sleep, we begin to sense what really made the monastery tick. And it wasn't just beans. Soon, we'll lift the candle toward another curiosity of cloistered life, the bizarre and blessed world of medieval monastic chores. Chapter 4. Of Cloisters and Cold. Feet. A Morning Ritual. Long before alarm clocks and the sting of cold tiles greeted our modern souls, there existed another kind of morning, quieter, colder, and infinitely more obedient. In the cloistered world of medieval monks, dawn was not welcomed, it was endured. Let us step gently into that first flicker of morning, as the stars yawn their final glimmers over the stone-tucked monastery. The sky is still undecided about being blue or grey, and a low mist hovers like a sleepy cat stretched over the earth. Inside thick limestone walls, the monastic dormitory exhales a chorus of soft snores, stiff joints, and rustling woolen robes. The bell is the first to stir. Hung on aged beams in the bell tower's craggy ribs, it tolls a low, sincere reminder that heaven waits. And punctuality is next to godliness. The sound is not jarring. It's like a foghorn wrapped in a blanket, persuasive, not panicked. Each monk, as practiced as a metronome, rises slowly from his simple cot. There's no coffee, only prayer. No slippers either, just cold, bare feet nestled momentarily in straw-stuffed sandals. These sandals are less luxury footwear and more loyal discomforts, companions that have likely outlived several abbots and yet still squeak with each resigned step. Matins, the first divine office of the day, begins in semi-darkness around 2:30 or 3 in the morning. Yes, you heard that right. Somehow, blundering through the dark toward a stone chapel with barely thawed toes was considered a privilege, a sacred one no less. After all, the early bird may get the worm, but the early monk gets to chant psalms in the company of angels and quite a bit of draught. Wrapped in woolen habits, the sort of outfit that could double as a sanctuary curtain, the monks proceed quietly down the cloisters. These covered walkways are deliciously Gothic, all arches and austerity, like a hallway designed by a very pious spider. The monks move in a line so silent it almost feels rude to blink. The chapel is dimly lit, save for a few sputtering candles and the inner glow of discipline. Heads are bowed. Psalms are chanted from memory or from battered manuscripts illuminated not with gold, but with growing familiarity. Gregorian chants begin, rising like warm breath on coal stone. You wouldn't exactly call it music you'd dance to, but something about those droning harmonies makes your soul sit up a little straighter. Now, we must talk about the cold. These were centuries before insulation and central heating. The chill in a medieval chapel seeps into the very marrow. It's not just inside your robe. It is your robe. But the monks do not shiver, or rather, they suppress the urge with holy dignity and steady inhalations. After all, shivering loudly during Psalm 119 could startle the novice beside you and attract side eyes from Brother Thomas, who hasn't blinked since Ascension Day. The first hour of prayer passes in measured cadences. The bell chimes again, and rather than collapse in a cozy chair with tea and toast, luxuries for a future society yet to invent couches, the monks return to their dormitory for a brief rest. Though rest is relative when your mattress is straw-filled canvas and your pillow is humility. Aside from orchestrating monkish serenity, mornings often involved a kind of logistical ballet. The monastery must run, after all. As twilight ebbs into daylight, assignments are distributed. Duties include illuminating manuscripts, keeping the chicken coop from theological schism, and of course, preparing a very humble breakfast. Typically of coarse bread, perhaps a dish of warm pottage, and a prayer that it wouldn't be turnip. Again. With chores still ahead, and their vows a warm echo in their hearts, the monks set about their quiet, orderly lives. They're like bees in slow motion, industrious, purposeful, and overly fond of Latin. But in those early morning hours, when the world was soft with mist and song, the monastery was more than stone. It was steadiness, a place where time passed in prayer, and feet, cold though they were, always found their way forward. And so, dear listener, as the monks begin their daily rounds, we'll wander on to a chapter where breakfast doesn't feature scrambled eggs, but does include something almost as stirring as honey: illuminated manuscripts. Chapter 5 of Bells and Bedtimes, the monastic evening wind down. As the sun drooped lazily behind the abbey walls, casting honey-coloured light across rows of cloistered arches, the monastery gently exhaled. The bells tolled their vesper lullaby, not quite a demand this time, but a polite invitation to begin the winding down. Evening had arrived, and in the monastic world, that meant it was nearly tomorrow. Now, in our modern times, evening might be a spirited hour, dinner, emails, reruns of something loud. But for a medieval monk, it was less action-packed and more sacredly silent. Picture soft wool habits rustling along the corridor, the flickering of beeswax candles glowing like tiny halos along the stone walls, and the lightest murmurs escaping from behind carved wooden doors like secrets told by sighs. Vespers, the sunset prayer hour, was a sort of spiritual exhale, a time to praise and ponder, fitting for a community whose drama peaked with a misplaced ink jar. Monks would gather in the choir stalls, most likely trying not to yawn, reciting psalms in Gregorian chant. Gregorian chant, by the way, is a type of music which, like so many aspects of monastic life, involves doing one thing very slowly, very seriously. After Vespers, depending on the century and their particular rule, and monks did love a good rule, they might share a meal, the second and final of the day. This was often soup or porridge, something humble, wholesome, and questionably chewable. A bowl of pottage, seasoned with a generous pinch of "it's all we have," was common. Occasionally, luxury reared its decadent head in the form of fish, though usually the kind that had been dried until it resembled wood and then soaked back into existence. The monks dined in something called the refectory, which is just a fancy Latin word for eating quietly among other people who are also eating quietly. Silences reigned here, more strictly than kings did. Conversation, if allowed at all, came in sighs, raised eyebrows, and the universally understood language of passing the salt, or rather, the powdered egg rind, if salt happened to be out of stock that decade. To keep minds on holy things and off indulgences like idle chatter or wondering what stew exactly is made of, a monk would read aloud during dinner. This noble soul, called the reader, likely regretted sitting in the wrong chair that morning. He'd stand at a wooden lectern and recite scripture or the lives of saints, many of which were full of blood, dragons, and fiery martyrdoms, but delivered here in a tone that bordered on slightly apologetic beige. After the meal, they cleaned their bowls and spoons. Yes, monks cleaned up after themselves, and moved into compline, the final prayer service of the day. Compline, derived from the Latin completorium, meaning completion, was less a spirited celebration and more a quiet blanket for the soul. The tone, think divine lullabies sung with downcast gaze. It stilled the mind, thanked the heavens no one had sinned spectacularly since lunchtime, and gently nudged the monastery toward bedtime. Now, you may be wondering about the bedtime rituals of a medieval monk. Pajamas, not quite. The same woolen habit that swaddled them during the day served as their evening attire, utterly impervious to trends or tides. Beds were simple. Wooden frames if one was lucky, straw-stuffed sacks if one was not. Blankets were few, as were pillow options. A luxurious arrangement might involve a woolen cloak doubled over and ever so slightly fluffed by hope. Despite modern assumptions, monks didn't always sleep through the night. No, their sleep was nobly interrupted. Depending on custom, around midnight the bell would toll again, prying them gently, or not so gently, from dreams of shining manuscripts and bottomless bread loaves. Up they would rise for nocturnes, a set of pre-dawn prayers reminding them and their knees that there is no rest for the devoted. But those few hours before midnight, those were sweet. The abbey would grow utterly still, the wind outside soft-footing across the grass, the coals in the hearth sighing their last, a quiet that could wrap around your shoulders and hush every hurried thought. For a monk, that silence wasn't empty. It was full of God, of peace, and probably the muffled snore of Brother Oswin in the next cell over. And so, the sacred rhythm continued, bell to bowl, chant to candle, from disciplining the spirit to dozing in straw. These were the evenings of monks, as routine as they were reverent. But what happened come morning, when the bells began again and the abbey stirred from its holy slumber? That is a tale we'll gently uncover next. Chapter 6. The quiet art of illuminating absolutely everything. In the dim silence of a medieval scriptorium, time did not merely pass, it politely tiptoed. Here, in rooms thick with patience and ink, monks practiced one of the most painstakingly beautiful and quietly impressive arts ever attempted by the human hand: illumination, which, despite its radiant name, had nothing to do with lighting and quite everything to do with spending 6 hours drawing a golden fish in the corner of a page about wheat prices. The process of illumination, which means to light up, referred to the ornate decoration of manuscripts. Each letter was given the royal treatment, a glow-up with gold leaf, vivid pigments, and tender adornments of vines, beasts, and sometimes inexplicably small naked people playing the trumpet. These were not accidental doodles. They were devotional flourishes, artistic Easter eggs hidden in holy texts to delight, perplex, and possibly raise an eyebrow. Our humble monastic scrollsmiths began their work long before their quills touched parchment. First, there was the parchment itself. Illumination required a very specific kind of paper, namely, not paper at all, but animal skin. Vellum, made from baby cow hide, or sometimes goat skin or sheepskin, was carefully prepared using a process that should never be discussed over dinner. Suffice it to say, it involved stretching, scraping, and an unsettling amount of lime. Once the pages were fit for holiness, the planning began. The monk artist, known as an illuminator, not to be confused with a light fixture, would sketch delicate outlines in a pale ink, a sort of medieval pencil. Often these sketches contain not only initials and margins, but lively scenes. Angels dancing like they just discovered grape juice, saints side-eyeing demons, and rabbits brandishing swords for ambiguous reasons. The colouring phase was where the magic happened, and also several blisters. Pigments were ground by hand from minerals, plants, and the occasional bug. The rich blue, known as ultramarine, that came from lapis lazuli, mined in what is now Afghanistan. It was so frightfully expensive that monks would sometimes write entire pages in slightly sadder blues, saving ultramarine for the Virgin Mary's robe and the occasional decorative snail. Then came the gold. To truly illuminate the page, gold leaf, beaten so thin it could float on a sigh, was applied to create that signature divine shimmer. The gold was adhered with a sticky substance whimsically called gesso, which may as well have been unicorn spit for all the reverence surrounding it. Applying gold was a high-stakes endeavour. It had to be done perfectly, or risk an editorial scolding from Brother Gregory, the resident perfectionist, who once fasted in protest over a mispainted wingtip. But lest you think illumination was a solitary pursuit, remember that this was a communal act, lined with cooperation and the occasional complaints about someone stealing your best squirrel hair brush. The monk who copied the letters, the scribe, the monk who added the decorations, the illuminator, and the monk who supervised and warningly asked everyone to please stop gluing things to the cat. They all worked in tandem. There were rules, of course. The rule of St. Benedict didn't say much about gold leaf, but it did teach humility, patience, and silence, which is perhaps why illuminated manuscripts contain so many tiny scenes of monks not being silent. Hidden in the margins were playful creatures, strange hybrids, and not so subtle critiques of abbots drawn with suspicious noses. Humor, it seems, survived even in sacred spaces, and perhaps even thrived among inkpots and candle wax. As for the purpose of this celestial artistry, it served a dual function: to glorify the divine and to fight boredom. Let us not underestimate how long a winter afternoon in a fireless scriptorium could feel. Decorating a page with a battalion of snails besieging a castle made of breadcrumbs was not heresy. It was therapy. With time, the illuminated books travelled beyond the cloister walls. Some were given as gifts to nobles, others kept in locked chests, and a rare few were actually read by someone other than the original monks. Yet each shimmered with the quiet devotion of hands that worked for days just to paint a halo the size of a lentil. So next time you see a medieval manuscript with its revolving saints and dancing dragons, remember, someone spent weeks painting that by candlelight in a room that smelled faintly of sheep and ink, all to light a little fire on a page. Now, as the flicker of the scriptorium dims for the night, let us follow the gentle winding stair into a quieter alcove of monastic life, a place where the bells told time and sometimes forgot the hour entirely. Chapter 7 of Cheese, Chores and Chilly Cloisters. Let us now shuffle delicately into the quieter corners of monastic life, far away from Latin chants and cloister politics, and tiptoe, ever so softly, into the domestic heart of the monastery, the place where habits were worn and habits were formed through chores. You see, for medieval monks, the spiritual journey was paved not only with psalms, but also with cabbage. And cabbage, as it turns out, is a particularly holy vegetable when consumed 7 days a week. Much of a monk's day was spent not in mystical contemplation or theological debate, but in tasks as earthly as peeling root vegetables, tending garden patches, and trying desperately not to fall asleep while milking a goat at dawn. Monastic life was, in this way, not quite a medieval version of magical Hogwarts, but rather more like a particularly tidy farm. At the heart of every monastery was the opus manuum, the work of the hands. This was sacred labour, not to be shunned, but gently embraced, much like a damp woolen sock that keeps returning from the laundry. Monks believed that manual labour served the soul, scoured the ego, and, conveniently, kept the cabbages trimmed. Each monk had tasks assigned. One might be the gardener, another devoted to the bakehouse, someone entrusted with the infirmary, a place thick with herbal teas, whispered prayers, and the unmistakable aroma of elderly sage, and of course, a lucky few chosen for the cheese cellar. Yes, the cheese monks. Calling them cheese monks may sound rather whimsical, but in truth, certain brothers were indeed tasked with developing rustic rounds of heavenly dairy. Cloistered from the world, their cheeses were left to mature in cool stone basements, rooms faintly echoing with Gregorian chant and the gentle hum of fermentation. These monks had a holy patience, waiting weeks and even months for their cheeses to ripen with grace and a modest rind. Their system of chores rotated with the grace of the seasons, a cycle as dependable as the tolling of the tower bell. Spring was for planting and mending the beehives. Summer called for haymaking, laundry, and the noble art of sheep shearing, which mostly consisted of reassuring anxious sheep that everything was perfectly fine. Autumn ushered in preserves and pickling, while winter brought indoor labours, candle making, copying manuscripts by candlelight, and the thrilling complexity of drying laundry in a damp cloister. And every chore was an act of devotion. Dusting the altar, a prayer in motion, tuning the chapel's organ, a sonnet to the divine, recorking the leaky latrine roof. Well, that was just wet, but still sacred. Now, daily chores often began before first light. Monks would rise in complete darkness, putting on their stiff robes, scratchy from being air-dried on ropes stretched across the cloister's cloisterous corners. Their footsteps would echo through stone corridors as the kitchens sparked to life. Grains ground, kettles boiled, and simple breakfasts prepared. Porridge, mostly. Occasionally sweetened with the dried fruit that monks had accidentally dropped into their robes during last week's cellar inventory. And oh, the kitchens. Far from modern gas stoves and dishwashers, a monastic cook's arsenal included oversized wooden spoons, iron cauldrons the size of bathtubs, and an unspoken rivalry with whichever monk had peeled the fewest turnips that week. Fires had to be tended constantly. Bread was baked in wood-fired ovens with an almost reverent timing, using sourdough starter likely older than the actual monastery. The process couldn't be rushed, for love, nor heat, nor impatient abbot. But even in labour, there was peace. The rhythmic whisper of bristles sweeping stone floors, the gentle clink of spoons in porridge pots, the serene act of brushing egg wash atop humble barley loaves. A monastery, after all, was not designed for haste. There were no bosses breathing down necks, only the quiet encouragement of centuries-old rule books and the ever-watchful gaze of mildly disappointed saints carved into chapel corners. And while the chores occasionally led to splinters, soiled habits, and the odd kitchen disagreement over the correct chive-to-leek ratio, they offered a sense of purpose, a sleepy satisfaction not unlike that felt by a contented cat napping in a sun-warmed windowsill. As the day wore on, and the last cheese was turned and the final floor swept, the monks would retire with sore backs, empty bowls, and quiet hearts. Their work, done with diligence and devotion, soothed them like the evening hymn, echoing faintly across time and tile. And as night wrapped its woolly shawl across the cloister, we too shall drift toward softer things, toward the hush of the scriptorium, where monks write not just with ink, but intention. Chapter 8. The Benedictine Snore and the Sacred Siesta. If you were to step into a medieval monastery at the high point of a sleepy afternoon, you might not find Gregorian chant echoing down a stone corridor. No, you might hear something, slightly less spiritual. Something like a soft snore echoing beneath a woolen hood. Something like the universal sound of a well-earned nap. Because in the Middle Ages, even the most pious among us knew, holiness requires sleep. Welcome to Chapter 8, where the candles burn low, the pages turn slower, and the monks tuck themselves gently into the rhythms of sacred slumber. Let us begin with the Rule of Saint Benedict, the grand spiritual instruction manual for Western monastic life. Written in the 6th century by Benedict of Nursia, a man who wore sandals even when it snowed. The rule was intended to create a balanced and disciplined monastic routine. It was also, quietly, very nap-friendly. You see, Brother Benedict, serious though he was, wisely understood that monks were not celestial robots. Monks could not live on prayer and porridge alone. They needed sleep, regular sleep, rationed like a holy soup. And so, the Benedictine rule suggested early bedtimes, late-night awakenings, and a divinely ordained nap. Yes, medieval monasteries instituted the sacred siesta, the holy hora sexta, after the midday meal. It happened around the 6th hour of the day, which, in monk math, was approximately noon. Picture it, a cloister quiet as a chapel, stone walls warming faintly in the sun, and entire rows of sleepy monks, heads bowed beneath hoods, not in prayer, but in pre-dreamy drowsiness. It was considered entirely proper and even virtuous to rest a bit during these hours. After all, the night was long and peppered with interruptions. Monks were often awakened at midnight, yes, midnight, for the divine office of vigils. 8 times a day, their prayers were scheduled, no matter the hour or the season. When your spiritual calendar wakes you before the roosters, you've earned that midday nap with the fullness of your soul. The idea of sleep as a spiritual discipline may sound strange to us now, huddled as we are around espresso machines and blue-lit devices. But for medieval monks, sleep was contemplation's cousin. It cleared the mind. It soothed the body. It was regulated, observed, and sometimes even moderately enjoyed. Now, don't imagine plush featherbeds or dreamy duvets. A monk's cell was not exactly what we'd call cozy. At best, it contained a straw-stuffed mattress, a wooden pillow that might double as penance, and a single woolen blanket, more of a suggestion than an embrace. But still, within those bare walls, tucked beneath rough linen sheets, the afternoon nap unfolded like liturgy. And if your imagination allows, now is the perfect time to picture Brother Oswald, our fictional medieval monk, whose name, we've decided, sounds particularly snoozy. Picture him finishing a bowl of lentil stew, which he eats with the enthusiasm one reserves for food that doesn't taste like anything. Then, he nods politely to Brother Clement, whose entire personality is shaped by how aggressively he blesses the bread. They exchange a sleepy glance, and then, with footsteps softened by sandals, each monk drifts quietly to his cell. And there, behind a heavy door that creaks with the prayer of old hinges, Brother Oswald removes his hood, folds it neatly, and stretches out upon his humble bedding. He does not toss nor turn. He does not need white noise or even a scented candle. He merely closes his eyes and imagines paradise, where the lentils are never burned and the abbot doesn't accidentally sing off key. By the quiet testament of this ancient nap, we are reminded that even the devout must yield to drowsiness. That sanctity is not incompatible with sleepiness, and that sometimes the most spiritual thing one can do is breathe deeply under a damp woolen sheet and dream of absolutely nothing. But not all monks found peace so easily. Some monasteries recorded the curious bedtime ailments of the devout. One manuscript refers to nocturnal unrest, a polite term for monks who either snored like a cathedral bell or flailed in their sleep like saints beset by phantoms. There are whispers, too, of monks woken by their own dreams of buttered bread or inappropriate thoughts about cheese. Such urges were promptly confessed, of course, followed by 3 extra psalms and, in some cases, a voluntary abstinence from dairy. By the time the evening bells rang, our monkish friends were once again alert, robes rustling, eyelids brave. Refreshed by rest, they would gather in the chapel to mutter prayers under breath and candlelight. Prayers that, occasionally, did contain a yawn or two. And as the moon climbed above timbered roofs, an owl stirred in the cloister's shadowy corners, the monks prepared once more for that sacred task of sleeping with intention, beneath stars that answered to no king. But before the night deepens, a question stirs gently in the warm folds of history. What did monks dream of in centuries gone by? The answer may be simpler and stranger than you think. Let's find out in the next soft-lit step of our journey. Chapter 9. Illuminated Letters and Illuminated Minds. In the warm hush of a medieval scriptorium, where the air smells faintly of vellum, beeswax, and the patient exhale of ink-stained sighs, the monk settles in again, hunched over a parchment, quill in hand, and eternity at his fingertips. Tonight, dear listener, we wander gently into the glowing world of manuscript illumination, a practice so carefully ponderous, so spectacularly serene, it might just lull even the most caffeine-addled brain among us straight to dreamland. First, let us set the scene. The scriptorium, from Latin scriptorium, quite literally a place for writing, was the beating heart of intellectual life within a monastery. But don't let the name fool you. This beating heart had a pulse rate of about 1 page per day, maybe 2 on holidays. Rows of wooden desks lined a narrow chamber, each one facing the same direction as if the monks were aircraft waiting for quiet, contemplative takeoff. Soft sunlight filtered through slits in stone walls. Occasionally, a gentle breeze might tumble a wayward scrap of parchment like a sleepy tumbleweed across the floor. And in these hush-drenched halls, with their echo of scratching quills and rustling robes, the scribes labored at their timeless task, copying, lettering, and illuminating books, one painstaking letter at a time. Now, illuminating is a rather radiant term. One might imagine lasers and neon signs. But in the medieval monastery, illumination meant something far less shocking. Decorating texts with gold leaf, vibrant pigments, and intricate designs that unfurled like daydreams in the margins. Illuminated manuscripts were the medieval equivalent of deluxe limited edition art books, except they took years to make, required crushed beetles, and were read almost entirely in Latin by individuals with interesting haircuts and vows of silence. The pigments came from far and strange places. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan ground into a twilight blue dust. Vermilion from Cinnabar, sulfur and mercury's unnerving child. And yes, cochineal beetles, crushed lovingly to provide a glowing red that was, well, to die for. Frequently by the beetles. But it wasn't all artistry and insect-based colour palettes. The monks were, above all, methodical. There was a rhythm to the work, like the breathing patterns of sleepy whales. Mornings spent copying clean lines of text. Midday meals of pottage and radish. Afternoons devoted to embellishing capital letters so grand they'd make your modern-day fonts blush. And evenings, perhaps, were spent deciphering precisely why Sister Margaret of Whitby had illustrated a duck jousting with a snail in the margin of the Book of Psalms. And oh, those margins. A surreal pasture of imagination. Animals playing musical instruments. Monkeys riding unicorns. Sadly, no one ever explained why the unicorn was always losing. These marginalia, a charming Latin word for bored monk doodles, or at least it should be, have puzzled historians and tickled late-night researchers for centuries. Some say they were moral allegories. Others insist they were inside jokes. One rather serious fellow suggests they were a coping mechanism for the deep, contemplative monotony of the monastic life. They were, perhaps, all of these at once, or none. What's certain is that these monks, with their patient hands and thoughtful eyes, created books that sang without voices, glowed without wires, and connected one century's prayers to the fingertips of the next. Through cold winters and silent weeks, their ink-dripping quills etched the world into memory. sentence by slow sentence. And while we think of medieval monks as solemn scribes wrapped in wool and restraint, there's something quietly joyful about the way they crowned their pages with dragons, jesters, rabbits baking pies, and saints playing the bagpipes. It tells us something, I think, that even in a life of endless quiet and repetition, the spirit seeks whimsy and cherishes colour. So let us imagine, just for a moment, the monk pausing after drawing the 16th gold-inked vine tendril, gazing out the narrow window as dusk draped the abbey like a velvet cowl. He stretches his back, flexes his ink-stiffened fingers, and perhaps smiles faintly at the tiny hidden cat he painted lounging beneath Psalm 42. A nod to mischief, a whisper of himself, a comforting truth tucked deep between immortal lines. And as soft candlelight tiptoes across the fresh vellum, we drift from the scriptorium now, carried gently into another evening's tale, where bells will toll and gardens will wait. Let us tread now ever so quietly toward the life beyond the quill, the humble toil of monastery gardens and the curious aromatic rituals that fed both body and soul. Chapter 10. Of cabbages and community, the cloister garden. Tucked behind heavy stone walls and serenely squared within the monastery grounds, the cloister garden was a tender breath of green amidst the grey rigidity of monastic life. It was not merely a patch of vegetables. It was an herbal poem, a leafy refuge, and perhaps most crucially, the nearest thing to a medieval monk's day at the spa. The garden wasn't just about growing food, although food was certainly a welcome byproduct. It was about cultivating virtue through the art of hoeing. For the monks, digging in the dirt wasn't punishment. It was considered laborare est orare, Latin for to work is to pray. Of course, after 6 hours of weeding, one might prefer a slightly shorter version of the Lord's Prayer, but such complaints were best whispered to the lettuce. Cistercians, Benedictines, and their many habit-bound cousins took their gardens very seriously. Herbs were planted in small, tidy patches arranged with a precision that would have pleased a geometry teacher or a particularly fastidious hedgehog. Thyme, rosemary, sage, and monastic mint grew in gentle clusters, while lines of leeks, onions, and cabbage stood proudly like green infantry in a salad battalion. Even the snails, sleepy and unhurried, showed a certain reverence as they slimed their silent way across the sacred spinach. And then there were the meditative monks, stooped beneath the sun in woolen robes, muttering psalms as they plucked weeds with the sort of slow deliberation perfected only by the extremely devout or those still half asleep. With wide sleeves dragging haphazardly through damp soil, they offered up a rhythmic shuffle of sandals and soft grunts, the Gregorian chant of mild physical exertion. For some monks, tending the garden was a relief from the more trying tasks of the scriptorium. Imagine spending 12 hours copying St. Augustine's treatise on free will only to realize you've spelled virtue incorrectly on every page. Compared to this, dusting a turnip seemed nearly contemplative. There was also a certain sacred sensuality to the gardens, a cloistered joy not quite holy, but close enough to be forgiven. A sun-warmed pea pod, snuck gently from its vine and popped discreetly into one's mouth. A tiny rebellion whispered in chlorophyll. The way the lavender nodded in the breeze felt suspiciously like flirtation, though only with the wind. Of course, it wasn't all quotidian peace and basil-scented bliss. Disputes occasionally arose. Brother Ambrosius once accused Brother Gerald of favouring his row of carrots with more manure than the communal cabbage. Brother Gerald retaliated by rerouting the watering trough, so that only his half of the garden got irrigated. This passive-aggressive arms race ended only when the abbot declared a time of silence and confiscated both of their trowels. Carrots, it turns out, can cause more trouble than crusades if left ungoverned. But generally, the garden was a haven. Things grew there, not in spite of silence, but because of it. Bees hummed thoughtfully between blossoms like tiny winged scholars. Cats from the nearby village sometimes slinked in, resembling soot wrapped in fur and impatience. They curled on warm paving stones, fully unimpressed by human sanctity, as if to remind the monks that while they might be holy, they were still amusingly slow at catching mice. Some gardens even had fish ponds, smooth-stoned, still as prayer, and home to lazy carp who knew exactly where the monks tossed breadcrumbs after mealtimes. These fish knew all the gossip too, if only you could translate a bubble. And yes, in quiet moments, there were monks who found God not only in scripture, but in the curl of young lettuce or the dew on a sage leaf, divinity expressed in chlorophyll and compost, in that soft green hush where violets basked and strawberries dared. Some monks felt the whispers of the divine more clearly than in any sermon. Gardens, after all, are earth's dreams made leafy. And when your days are predictable and set by bells, a bean sprout breaking earth can feel like fireworks. Nearby, Brother Oswin crouched low, whispering encouragement to a struggling parsley plant. His knees creaked, his back ached, but he believed, with quiet conviction, that the parsley would prevail. Eventually, the bell rang for sext, the midday hour of prayer, and the monks set down their spades one by one. They brushed soil from their hands with the solemn reverence of those who have just baptized potatoes. And so, their garden moment ended, brief, earthy, and just a little bit miraculous. As the procession faded into the cloister's shade and the bees resumed their sleepy buzz, we drift just a little further into the monastic world. Let us now turn to what happens when a monk tries to cook with only turnips and theological ambition. Chapter 11. The Quiet Drama of the Cloister Garden. There is something endlessly peaceful about a garden with no ambition. It doesn't strive to be grand or exotic. It simply grows quietly, deliberately, tucked beneath the watchful steeple of a monastery. In the cloister gardens of medieval monks, miracles didn't descend from heaven with fanfare. They were more likely to sprout from cabbage patches. Let us drift now into the scented hush of one such garden. The air is cool and moist, with the kind of silence that sounds like it's been waiting all morning for you to notice it. The light glimmers gently off dewdrops clinging to sage leaves, and a particularly rotund bumblebee patrols the lavender like an amateur security guard, suspicious of everything. These gardens were not decorative in the way of royal rose displays or flamboyant tulip beds. No, they were mission-critical botanical outposts. The monks relied on them for just about everything: herbs for healing, plants for dyeing robes, vegetables for meals, and occasional raspberries for highly spiritual snacking. Imagine a Benedictine brother in his habit, kneeling in the dirt with vast reverence, not simply because he's planting coriander, but because to him, the act of gardening was an imitation of paradise. Eden recreated in neat rows of leeks and marjoram, presided over by an abbot with suspiciously green thumbs. Every plant had a purpose. Calendula wasn't just orange cheer in calendrical form. It soothed wounds and made a decent dye, depending on the patience of the monk extracting it. Comfrey was grown for its wound-healing charms, though also for the sneaky pleasure of saying comfrey aloud, which sounds like a plant that hugs you back. The monasteries often housed herbariums, both as actual gardens and handwritten manuals. These damp-smelling booklets, scribbled in Latin that grew more imaginative as the years passed, provided detailed information about how to prepare everything from nettles to nightmares. Steep elderflowers until the solution smells like a perilous meadow at dawn, one particularly poetic monk might write, or scribble a margin note suggesting that dandelion root might cure melancholia, or, at the very least, boredom. There was no such thing as just gardening for these monks. It was liturgy with trowels. Cultivating basil wasn't merely botanical, it was devotional. After all, had not God arranged the cosmos itself with law and order? Then surely a neat row of carrots was merely an earthly echo of divine logic. It's restful to imagine the pace there. No one rushing. Silence only gently broken by the sound of rustling robes, the scraping of a wooden rake, or the occasional Latin expletive when the beats misbehaved. And the compost pile, a heaping, fragrant monument to the circle of life. Nothing wasted, everything considered. Lettuce leaves returning to the soil, peels of last week's turnips mingling with straw, sacred decomposition occurring at a prayerful pace. One monk, perhaps the monastery's unofficial warden of the wastes, may have even maintained a diary on the moods of the compost heap, ranging from lively and hearty to brooding and contemplative. But the real centerpiece of the cloister garden wasn't necessarily its plants. It was its function as a cloistered space. A courtyard, often bordered by covered walkways and columns, where monks could walk in meditative circles. It was the heart of the monastery, figuratively and sometimes literally. Here they paced slowly, brow serene, thoughts drifting heavenward or simply to the whereabouts of their sandals. In warmer weather, the garden often played host to friendly robin guests or a particularly self-important cat. The monks never named the cat, of course. It would have been far too worldly, but it certainly attended vespers and could be found sprawled lazily in pools of sunlight like a furred saint. All in all, the cloister garden was a quiet rebellion against the chaos of the outer world. While lords chased boarders and plague wagons rattled through muddy towns, the monks were here, debating which mint best soothed the belly. We close this chapter beneath a fig tree, its leaves casting dappled shadows across warm stone paths. Somewhere above, the bells toll softly in the tower, not as summons, but reminders. Time continues but slowly, and under the watchful gaze of onions and thyme, we drift onward. Next, hush now, we trace the footsteps of monks beneath moonlight as we explore their nightly rituals and sacred silences. Chapter 12. The whispering silence of the scriptorium. Shh. Hear that? No, not the modern hum of traffic or the soft buzz of your refrigerator, but the quieter quiet. A silence so thick it has weight filled, with the scratchings of goose quills and the occasional sigh of a monk who slightly smudged the capital D. We have arrived at the scriptorium, a chamber in the monastery where sacred texts were copied, one meticulous letter at a time, by some of the most patient humans to ever exist. Imagine a long stone room lit by shafts of honeyed sunlight slipping through narrow windows. Rows of desks face the light, each one equipped with parchment, ink, and a quill that's seen 100 psalms and at least one moment of existential despair. Monks sat bundled in woolen habits, bent at the neck like question marks, fully engaged in the holiest of transcription marathons. These weren't ordinary scribbles. Every letter was a work of discipline and devotion. Illuminated manuscripts, truly masterpieces that combined calligraphy with flamboyant flair. had curlicues more whimsical than a wizard's mustache and gold leaf so shiny, it nearly compensated for the fact that it took 3 weeks just to write one glorious page. Modern folks might call it scrapbooking with divine authority. The silence was absolute. Except, of course, when Brother Gregory's stomach betrayed him with an audible growl during Lent, or when a monk sneezed and lost 3 hours' worth of ink lines to a splotch of medieval mucus. Sneezes were one of the few permitted interruptions. After all, there's no shushing someone whose soul may be momentarily escaping the nose. The ink they used was not your standard office supply either. It was made from oak gall, the result of a tiny wasp's misadventure with a tree, and bound with iron salts. Yes, in a twist of tiny terror, insects contributed to preserving the theological backbone of medieval Europe. Quills were typically fashioned from goose or swan feathers, each carefully hardened and trimmed. A monk with a perfect quill was akin to a knight with a sturdy sword, but with more back pain and fewer opportunities for glorious death speeches. And speaking of pain, there was the posture. Monastic medicine had little regard for ergonomics. Some monks would lean forward so often and so long that they developed permanent hunches. There's one letter from the 10th century in which a monk complains of exhaustion and comments, "My hand is weary with writing. My eyes are dim with seeing. My neck hurts. I feel like a parched desert vine." And yet, he probably carried on with Amen just below that and started the next line before his ink even dried. Occasionally, for morale or novelty, a creative scribe might sneak a little marginal doodle. Tiny dragons snacking on bishops, bunnies jousting, or knights fighting snail armies. Yes, snails. The snails are still a mystery, by the way. A lingering question nestled in the margins of time, like a forgotten biscuit behind a bookshelf. But despite the aches and the curious mollusk menace, the scriptorium was a place of meditative joy. It offered a slow beauty, the beauty of creation at a glacial pace, where each mark on vellum was a fingerprint of eternity. One could spend weeks with a single gospel, pouring soul into serif and flourish until the divine truth gleamed from the page like dew on morning grass, with fewer insect legs. It wasn't all spiritual nobility, of course. Monks occasionally left passive-aggressive footnotes, like one who scribbled, "Oh my hand," at the end of a particularly long text, or delightfully, "I am very cold," written in a book of homilies. Suffering may be holy, but a small complaint was allowed, if offered in Latin. The scriptorium was not simply a room, it was a world so quiet you could hear your ink settle, so deliberate that modern urgencies melt away, and so rich that its legacy still shimmers faintly in dusty libraries, like the softened glow of candlelight after midnight. So now, let your mind slip gently from the stone benches and paper-thin pages. The ink dries, the quills rest. The monks bow their heads, not in toil, but prayer, and the silence of the scriptorium swells with dreams of parchment and peace. And beyond that ancient doorway, beyond those hallowed thresholds, lies another corner of monastic life that hums softly in the shadows, where not all was sacred scripture, and not all ink was black. Chapter 13. The Lost Art of Listening to Bells. Nothing quite says medieval monastic life like the rhythmic clang of a bell echoing across misty cloisters. If silence was golden, then the bell was its gentle chime, reminding monks that even gold has a schedule. Our scene opens in the early ichor-coloured morning, before the sun commits to anything ambitious. Picture a Benedictine monastery tucked into a valley, where fog hugs the ground like an overly affectionate sheepdog. somewhere within those stone walls. The bell tower. Grand. Not exactly. Slightly tilted. Perhaps. Spiritually punctual. Oh, absolutely. Bells were the faithful timekeepers of a world without wristwatches, smartphone alarms, or 5 more minutes. For monks bound by the rule of Saint Benedict, the bell wasn't just an auditory cue. It was the voice of divine order, God's gentle knock, reminding you that it's time to chant, pray, or, once in a blue moon, eat soup. During the 9th to 12th centuries, these bells weren't your average door chime. Many were forged by the same artisans who crafted church bells for entire towns, and their sounds were carefully tuned, or at least enthusiastically hammered, to invoke reverence. Not all abbey bells were polished sonatas. Some likely sounded like a cow clearing its throat through a tin horn. But to the monks, every clunk conveyed meaning. Matins, prime, terce, sext. None sounded particularly thrilling, but each bell brought the soothing certainty of knowing what came next. And oh, the hierarchy of bells. Large bells for great events, tiny ones for meal times, though hungry monks often claimed to hear them an hour early. There was also the Sanctus bell, which got to ring during the holiest part of Mass. Monks in charge of ringing it were caught occasionally peeking around in smug fulfillment, as if saying, "Yes, I am," in charge of holiness acoustics, and who managed these sacred clangings orchestrated across the hours. Meet the campanarius, the monastery's bell ringer-in-chief, a job requiring acute hearing, precise timing, and occasionally the courage to climb creaky ladders in drizzle. Most bell towers were not heated, which was also true of everything else really. So the campanarius became a master of chilled fingers and punctuality. It wasn't glamorous, but it was vital. After all, monks didn't tell time by peering at sundials strapped to their robes. Measuring time was a full-on group activity, akin to communal breathing. Bell ringers often relied on water clocks in the early years, basins dripping at a calibrated rate, disturbingly easy to upset with just a minor draft and an overzealous rat. Later came mechanical clocks, those delightful gear-riddled inventions that ticked and tocked so heartily they frightened geese. In the sacred hush of the scriptorium, monks would glance up not at the sun, but toward the doorway, waiting for the first tremble of the mid-morning bell. The sound would travel through the stone corridors like a memory of time itself. In dormitories and chapter houses, meals would pause, conversation would halt, assuming there had been conversation, and feet would shuffle reverently toward the next obligation. Still, even in this scheduled serenity, life had its hiccups. Bells once rang 2 hours late when a snoozy campanarius mistook his cat's purring for the early bell. Another tale tells of a novice misreading the hour bell and accidentally summoning everyone for vespers during what was supposed to be nap time, a grievous offence given monks' deep affection for rare moments of rest. But perhaps the most charming detail is how bells didn't just rule lives, they marked them. Each brother knew them like you know the hum of your refrigerator. The bells were companions through decades. A young novice might hear the same resonant tones as an old man, his life bracketed softly by the same peals that first woke him on his first day in the cloister. They rang endings, beginnings, and the great in-between. They called souls to prayer, to labor, to dinner, and possibly to contemplate whether fasting would be tolerable if it weren't always on cabbage soup day. So next time you hear a distant bell, and you will, perhaps in dreams, imagine a hunched little monk in sandals, lifting the rope and guiding heaven's chimes back to earth. And speaking of earthly matters, Our next tale involves something just as crucial to medieval monastic existence: sandals, silence, and the curious art of walking without squeaking. Chapter 14. Illuminating Silence, the Monastic Art of Copying. Manuscripts. Far from the clang of swords and the roar of medieval markets, within the quiet stone embrace of a scriptorium, monks waged a different sort of battle. Here, in this hushed sanctuary of ink and patience, the only enemy was the occasional smudge, and perhaps the creeping stiffness of the lower back. The scriptorium, for those blissfully unfamiliar with Latin floor plans, was the designated chamber in a monastery where monks spent their waking hours copying manuscripts by hand. Yes, by actual human hand. Page after page, letter by letter. A monk's version of Ctrl plus C and Ctrl plus V, but infinitely more painstaking and infinitely more likely to involve a goose feather. Clutching their quills, quaintly known as pens before pens got clicky, scribes huddled over parchment like ancient scholars or extremely focused origami enthusiasts. The work required absolute silence, an almost sacred hush broken only by the occasional sneeze, belly gurgle between meal times, or whispered muttering as Brother Cedric forgot how to spell Chronica Majora. For the 5th time that week, their eyes strained beneath the faint glimmer of daylight streaming through narrow windows, because candles, those delightful safety hazards of the 13th century, were discouraged near flammable manuscripts. The flickering flames posed more threat to pages than heresy ever did, and no monk wanted to be remembered for accidentally setting fire to the Life of St. Cuthbert because he sneezed on a taper. Now, you might be wondering, what were these monks writing? Oh, all sorts of gems. Scripture, biographies of saints, theological treatises that could put even a rooster to sleep, and occasionally exuberantly illustrated bestiaries, glorious medieval word and picture books showcasing animals real, imagined, or drunk on artistic liberty. These books weren't mass-produced. They were singular treasures. A single Bible could take years to complete, its pages adorned with painstaking calligraphy and illuminated with gold leaf, lapis lazuli blues, and the occasional bunny jousting against a snail. Medieval whimsy, it turns out, wasn't limited to peasants pretending vegetables were knights. The artistry wasn't just decoration, it was devotion. Each embellished letter, each glinting border, was an offering to both God and future librarians. The monks believed that beauty spoke to divinity, even if it occasionally resembled something drawn by a particularly imaginative house cat. And let us not forget the marginalia, the little notes, doodles, and complaints scribbled into the margins of the text. History owes a great deal to these footnotes of frustration. Some monks expressed their fatigue, "Oh, my hand," while others waxed philosophical. The ink is thin, but the will is thinner. A few got cheekily poetic. As the rose blooms red, so too does my poor posterior from this bench. Their grumbles were not only endearing, they were deeply human. Behind every illuminated letter stood a monk with tired eyes, cramped fingers, and possibly a mild dislike for uppercase G's. Of course, errors happened. Human ones. Words were missed, lines skipped, entire saints briefly forgotten. Enter the corrector, a monk tasked with catching mistakes and gently pointing them out, with all the tact of someone who just found a misspelled word in the Bible. Corrections involved carefully scraping the parchment with a dull blade, so as not to pierce the expensive calfskin, and rewriting the correct word. It was delicate work, equal parts surgery and serenity. Some endeavors were collaborative. One monk copied text, another painted the illuminations, and a third smeared a thumbprint in the corner because he forgot his tea was hot. It was, in the gentlest way, a chorus of quiet dedication. The scriptorium formed the heartbeat of monastic intellectual life. It maintained the ancient texts of antiquity, preserved works of Aristotle and Augustine alike, and even passed down recipes for medieval ink, which included such drama as oak galls and iron salts steeped like tea for the soul. And that silence, oh, that rich golden quiet, wrapped around each monk like a woolen robe. No rush, no buzzing phones, just the slow, sacred procession of thought to page. Monks copied more than just scripture. They copied patience into their very breath. As moonlight brushed the stone sill and another page met its final period, Brother Oswin stretched his sore finger joints, blinked into the candleless dusk, and whispered a prayer not just of thanks, but of relief. Next time, we'll step away from parchment and quill and peer into the soft shuffle of laundry day beneath the cloisters, where even the most ascetic monk finds himself face to face with a missing sock. Chapter 15. The Secret Society of Scribes and the Silence of Squill Ink. In a quiet scriptorium behind the cloisters of stone, where sunlight filtered in like spilled honey and the air smelled faintly of parchment and patience, the monks engaged in what they believed to be one of the holiest, most precise, and, dare we admit, most squint-inducing labours of the monastery: manuscript copying. Now, you might not think of ink and quills and long, unreadable Latin texts as the stuff of dreams. But for the medieval monk, this task was not just noble. It was a sacred calling, and a surprisingly cozy one at that. Picture it. Brother Oswin, sandal-footed and wool-hooded, hunched over a piece of vellum, his goose-feather quill whispering across the page. His lips moved in time with the syllables he was copying, eyes blinking slowly like a cat in sunlit indifference. Behind him, Brother Alcuin stifled a yawn and dipped his pen into the inkpot, and promptly knocked it over onto his sleeve. Yes, even sanctified scribes had clumsy moments. Thankfully, spilling ink was not considered a sin, merely a minor tragedy in the life of a man who'd already recopied Psalms 8 times in 5 years. The scriptorium was the soundless heartbeat of the monastery, and within its walls, monks partook in what you could call meditative transcription. Writing out illuminated manuscripts by hand was not just language work, it was artistry wrapped in devotion, dipped in squill ink, and finished with a touch of gold leaf that shimmered like starlight trapped in leather binding. The process was exact and slow, often requiring a full day to copy just a few pages. Monks would line the pages using sharp-tipped instruments, fill in the letters with painstaking care, and sometimes embellish the margins with what modern scholars refer to as drolleries, but what might more accurately be described as the bored scribbler's doodles. Tiny rabbits jousting with snails, monkeys in knightly armour, a nun wielding a sword against a dragon made of frogs. These weren't symbolic theological metaphors. These were signs that even the most devout needed a little fun at the margins of their minds. Illuminated manuscripts were more than word holders. They were sacred scrolls and art portfolios, and for monasteries, a form of wealth, rich in learning, priceless in craftsmanship, and many centuries later, delightfully meme-worthy. The ink they used was often made from iron gall, harvested from oak tree growths that resemble frowning acorns. This ink had longevity, but a mind of its own. One monk, recorded in a marginal note likely never meant for future readers, simply wrote, "This ink is the devil's milk. May my pen go dry before it stains more of my robe. The quills came from geese, mostly the left wing, right for left-handed monks in theory, although truly left-handed monks often weren't allowed to be left-handed at all. To be blunt, in medieval monkdom, being left-handed was viewed as suspicious, a bit too unorthodox, if not outright sinister, which you may note derives from the Latin sinistra, meaning both left and unlucky. Poor Brother Cuthbert. Once copied, manuscripts required drying time, binding, and often classifying into great wooden shelves that creaked under the theological heft of centuries. A monk could spend an entire decade copying the Bible in Latin and never once glance up long enough to notice a thunderstorm roll by. Silence, too, was sacred in the scriptorium. There was a sacred stillness about the place, broken only by the subtle sounds of work. Quill against page, the soft crackle of parchment, and the occasional resigned sigh from a monk who just realized he'd skipped a line somewhere back in Exodus. Mistakes were not taken lightly. Some scribes would scrape away errors with a knife until the parchment was smooth again. Others would flag the issue with neat inscriptions such as hic eravi, Latin for oops. And yet, within this repetitive, tranquil occupation, there dwelled a quiet joy. Being a scribe meant preserving human knowledge for centuries to come. Each page copied was a whisper echoing out through time, from one candle-lit room to the next, across generations too sleepy to remember who lit the first flame, but ever grateful for its glow. As the candles burned low and the inked pages lay drying like leaf litter in the autumn, Brother Oswin would close his eyes just a moment, perhaps dreaming of letters dancing like angels over fields of vellum. Speaking of movement and dreams, not every monk was confined to the cloisters forever. Tomorrow, we'll gently wander beyond the walls into the monastic herb gardens, where more than time was growing, and where vegetables may have gossiped if you asked them sweetly. Chapter 16 of Laundry, Lint, and the Lord. At the Abbey of Sleepyshire, our dreamily ordinary monastic refuge tucked away in the English countryside, spiritual devotion took many forms. Some sang praises, some copied manuscripts, and others did laundry. Yes, dear listener, tonight we turn our feather-down focus upon the basin, the bucket, and the beatified boredom of monkish laundry, because even in centuries embroidered with dragons and relics, someone still had to unsoil Brother Walter's woolen habit. Washing, like so much in monastic life, was viewed both literally and allegorically. Benedict himself, the patron pope of practicality, suggested that monks should live simply, cleanly, and communally. He did not, however, supply detergent recommendations or fabric softeners. Instead, he merely insisted that a monk's clothing be suitable and given out in moderation, and that bathing not be neglected too long. The implication: cleanliness was next to godliness, but don't get carried away. Every monastery had its own lavatorium, a pleasant Latin word that sounds like a wizard's bathroom, but was in fact the washing quarter, an area complete with a stone basin or trough, often outdoors, near the cloisters. Rainwater was often collected in cisterns, funneled via mossy medieval aqueducts that dribbled with dignified indifference. Armed with wooden paddles, rough-hedged soap, and unrelenting patience, monks would gather for what could best be described as a slow-motion water ballet of scrubbing, wringing, and contemplative sighing. Soap back then was its own unique adventure. It was typically made by boiling animal fat, often from pigs, with ashes. The result was an early form of lye soap that cleaned with fervent resolve and mild vengeance. Clothes came out cleaner, skin came off in sympathy. It stung, it burned, it worked. Any monk with soft hands did not work very hard in the laundry. Linen undergarments were washed weekly, which, by 13th century standards, was scandalously hygienic. Outerwear, especially woolen habits, took longer between cleanings, not for lack of will, but because drying them could take days, especially in the eternal drizzle of northern Europe. A monk caught in a sudden fog might have to spend the day smelling like a damp sheep, and yet, somehow, that was the more dignified scent available to him. Clothes lining was an art. With no plastic clips or sunny laundromats, monks relied on wooden pegs, breezy eaves, and silent hopes that the local birds would perch elsewhere. Worn robes, once drained and beaten upon flat stones, were hung high in the cloisters or near the herb garden, fluttering like pious flags of surrender. This brought the subtle joy of watching Brother Barnabas's drawers dance solemnly in the wind, a rite of humour preserved through centuries of stiff collars and gentle chuckles. The act of laundering provided a kind of meditative rhythm, beating the cloth, rinsing in cool water, humming a psalm under one's breath, shaking out a sleeve heavy with water and minor regret. In a world lit by candlelight and mysticism, there was something beautifully grounding about hand-washing a cowl still sticky from last night's spilled leek stew. For some monks, especially the novices, laundry duty fell under the spiritual category of humilitas. Scrubbing the abbot's tunic was not just a task. It was a chance to humble oneself before both cloth and creator. Theoretically, it built virtue. Practically, it built forearms. And if you're wondering about the fashion scene in a monastery, rest easy. It was a one-garment runway. Everyone wore more or less the same thing: a long tunic, a belt, sometimes a scapula, a square of cloth worn over the shoulders, and foot coverings that were more hope than shoe. The simplicity ensured that laundry rotation went smoothly. "Is this your tunic, Brother Godfrey?" "Can't be. Mine has more patches on the armpits." A thrilling deduction it was not, but it did keep mix-ups to a minimum. Occasionally, laundering turned political. A travelling bishop might complain of inferior starching. A noble patron might donate softer linens, leading to whispered jealousies. And one must never forget the infamous vinegar-soaking incident, when Brother Cedric misread a cleaning recipe and left 3 habits smelling like the bottom of a pickling barrel till Advent. Still, in the slow trickle of monastic time, laundry was a constant, a quiet comfort, a tired tunic made new again. It was not glorious, but it was good, and for monks whose life pulsed to the rhythm of bells and prayers, there was something deeply sacred in making dirty things clean. Let your mind drift now like linen on a line, soft and sunlit, and as the wind hushes gently through the cloisters, we shall next turn to a room not typically associated with pillow talk, the scriptorium, where silence reigned, quills scratched like ancient whispers, and inky hands told time by the drip. Chapter 17. The Silent Symphony of the Scriptorium. Somewhere beyond the tick of clocks and the trudge of modern inboxes, there existed a realm where time took the shape of feathered quills and the gentle scratch of ink across treated vellum. Welcome to the Scriptorium. The Scriptorium was the beating, though barely audible, heart of a monastery. A quiet chamber humbly dressed in wooden desks, utter devotion, and the endlessly patient presence of centuries. It smelled of ink, candle wax, dusty leather bindings, and the occasional unwashed habit of Brother Jeff, who kept misplacing his robe after Compline. Here within this sacred copying room, monks performed the noble, if slightly eye-watering task of preserving knowledge, word by word, line by line. Long before the Library of Alexandria burned, and light years before smartphones began flashing urgent headlines, these gentle scribes were squinting at Latin with ink-stained fingers and eternal patience. Now, if you imagine rows upon rows of robed bookworms gossiping over manuscripts like baristas at a cafe, I must politely nudge your imagination. The scriptorium was as silent as a confession booth on Tuesday. These weren't chatty scribblers. They were the custodians of silence. You see, silence wasn't just encouraged. It was sacred. Whispers, murmurs, even an unfortunate sneeze might draw disapproving glances stacked higher than a tower of codices. A particularly loud hiccup could earn you 3 days of dish duty in the kitchens, right next to that one monk who refused to believe in seasoning. Each monk had his station, lit softly by daylight dribbling in from high, narrow windows. Large, wooden desks sloped just so, ideal for manuscript work and for catching crumbs of the occasional secret pastry, with their ink pots carefully set into carved hollows and knives for trimming quills at the ready. The scribes set to work as though time itself depended on precise serif edges and elegant footnotes. A holy task this was. They copied not only scriptures, but medical treatises, fables, old Roman histories, and surprisingly inconsistent bestiaries. The snarling griffin may have had eagle wings and lion claws one day, and squirrel ears with bat feet the next. Depended on Brother Thomas's artistic whim, and whether he got enough porridge at breakfast. Mistakes did happen, dear dreamer. Even the saintliest monk could nod off mid-Leviticus and awaken to find that he'd accidentally copied the genealogy of Abraham twice. To err is human, to quietly scrape off the mistake with a knife and hope no one notices. That's monastic tradition. Proofreaders, called correctors, would double-check each manuscript like hawks in woolen robes. These men had the persistence of a tax auditor and the temperament of an unimpressed pigeon. Their job was to make sure each text remained faithful to its source, while maintaining legible margins and dignified Latin. An ink blot was cause for minor despair. A doodle of a naughty bishop in the margin, however, might mysteriously survive the inspection, especially if cleverly hidden behind a decorative O from omnibus. You might think such a life dull, but to those monks, it was thrilling in its own hushed way. There was joy in the rhythm of letters, in perfecting the art of calligraphy, and in knowing they were preserving knowledge that might otherwise be forgotten. They were the keepers of eternity, scribbling bridges across the ages. And oh, the artistry! Illuminated manuscripts gleamed with gold leaf, vermilion, and lapis lazuli, a pigment so rare it was pricier than certain saints' relics. Each decorative letter, each swirl and vine trailing along the margins, was a prayer in itself. Tiny angels perched beside verses, and cows, blessed cows, who unwittingly donated their hides to make fine parchment, sometimes peeked out playfully from the illustrations as if offering a posthumous wink. The work was slow. A single Bible might take several years to complete. Imagine the dedication. Imagine the cramp. Imagine the staggering number of times someone muttered Benedictus just because they dropped their quill again. And when the day's light dimmed to shadows, the monks cleaned their tools, blew out candles with the ceremony of sleep descending, and filed silently from the scriptorium. Scrolls and codices rested on shelves like dreaming dragons, their knowledge safely tucked in for the night. Now, as you drift like parchment through the hours, we'll meander next to a ritual every bit as disciplined yet slightly more fragrant, the monkish art of brewing. let that thought steep gently. Chapter 18. The Aromatic Art of Medieval Monastic Gardens. Sleep drifts more easily on the scent of lavender and the rustling of sage. And so, dear wanderer of time's quiet corridors, let us take a tranquil turn into one of the most overlooked wonders of the monastic world: gardens. Not the grand manicured hedgerows of King So-and-so's manor, but the humble, fragrant plots tended by monks with muddy sandals and tired robes, and surprisingly green thumbs. Behind the stone walls of the abbey and past its draughty cloisters lay a secret utopia, the herb garden. These weren't gardens for show, mind you. No waltzing peacocks, no dancing fountains. Just rows upon gentle rows of wholly useful plants, each leaf, root, and sprig selected with the precision of an alchemist and the patience of a snail on pilgrimage. To the casual eye, a medieval monastic garden might look like organized chaos, but to the monks, it was a library written in green. There was tansy for warding off worms, both intestinal and possibly biblical, angelica against evil spirits, and feverfew for headaches, though medieval headaches were really more of a personality trait than a condition. Lavender, called nada by the very learned, was grown in abundance. Not only was it handy against lice, but it also perfumed those scratchy woolen habits with a heavenly calm that rivaled any sermon. Sweet basil would have been rarer, more southern and exotic. But marigold, oh yes, always marigold, the poor man's saffron. Also good for grief, apparently, in case the lentil soup turned out badly again. Each morning, well, each post-lauds and breakfast-soaked oatmeal kind of morning, a designated group of monks would walk out into the garden, baskets in hand, sleeves rolled up just past elbow level for maximum humility visibility. Tending to the garden was both labor and love, equal parts botany and sanctified therapy. The world might tremble with Viking raids or crop failures or heretical arguments about cheese during Lent, but the garden grew steady and serene, a quiet green pulse behind the abbey walls. Wolfbert, our fictional representative monk, who insists on being gently fictional for modesty's sake, took particular pride in his mint patch. Mint is for the breath and for the blessing, he'd say, tucking leaves into the pockets of passing novices who'd perhaps taken their vow of silence a bit too onion-heavy. Fruit trees lined the edges of some gardens, though apples were the reliable stars. Not all plump and polished like today's varieties, but the sort of tart, woodland apples that inspired poetry and toothaches. And wherever apples went, so too did bees, kept in dome skeps made of straw, buzzing politely, producing honey that flavored remedies, sweetened porridge, and gave monks an excuse to write about the sweetness of God in rather sticky metaphors. Even weeds, bless them, had their place. Dandelions weren't just an aggressive yellow nuisance. They were medicine, for digestion, for detoxing, and, in the more creative recipes, for dyeing cloth a colour somewhere between mustard and misplaced optimism. No medieval garden was complete without a few tall medicinal plants meant to tower dreamily in corners. Comfrey, with its awkwardly fuzzy leaves, and elecampane, standing like a shaggy grace note at the back of the patch. Each herb was logged in the apothecary's notebook, usually handwritten in Latin, which made translations humorous at best and legally vague at worst. Apply to the wound. The monk wonders, which plant was that, garlic or goosefoot? Occasionally, pilgrims or peasants would wander in seeking some ointment or poultice, and the monastic gardener would oblige, ceremoniously plucking horehound or yarrow while muttering not incantations, but aggravations like, "Again with the chilblains, Brother Edric." What's astonishing in this sleepy little corner of history is how meticulously these earthy brethren observed and recorded nature. They knew lunar planting cycles, soil qualities, companion planting theories, and the particular moods of snails. Quietly, gently, through trowel and prayer, they were the preservationists of ancient agricultural wisdom. And while the rest of the world marched on with swords and suspicion, these gardeners healed, cultivated, and accidentally invented herbal shampoo. So if you're ever woken by a strange dream of thyme sprigs tucked behind your ear, it's probably just Brother Wolfbert composting in your subconscious. Nestle down now, dear listener. Next, we'll amble sleepily through the curious customs around monastic hospitality and the grand puzzle of how to feed visitors while pretending not to enjoy it. Chapter 19. Illuminated Letters and Ink-Stained Fingers. Among the many curious comforts of medieval monastic life, few were as meditative or as dizzyingly detailed as the art of manuscript illumination. In candle-lit scriptoria, cloaked in quiet and the unmistakable scent of sheepskin parchment, monks bent their backs and their eyes to the exquisite task of copying books, very, very slowly. Now, one might think that copying religious texts day after day would be dry work, perhaps even the literal definition of monotony. But for a monk with a flair for fine lines and dramatic initials, it was anything but. For them, every page was a canvas. Christ may have walked on water, but Brother Theobald walked the margins of the Psalms with rabbits in waistcoats and dragons doing backflips. You see, manuscript illumination was not just about words. It was about color, imagination, and, in many cases, sneaking an inside joke into the eternal Word of God. One could spend hours on a single letter, swathing it in gold leaf, surrounding it with vines that curled like sleepy dreams, and cats that looked suspiciously like Father Gilbert's tabby. The inks were as serious as the scriptures. There was oak gall ink, brewed from the bumpy growths found on trees, which required vinegar, iron salts, and a dash of patience. And, on unlucky days, a reminder to never scratch your eye after stirring it. To get a shimmering gold, monks used tiny specks of real gold mixed into gum arabic, and then spent silent hours trying not to sneeze it off the page. There were reds from lead or crushed insects, blues from lapis lazuli, a holy stone imported all the way from Afghanistan, and greens that may or may not have been slightly poisonous. A monk could devote 5 years to a single gospel, develop chronic neck stiffness, and occasionally forget what sunlight looked like. But oh, the blues would shine like bottled serenity. The scriptoria themselves were curious places, humming with the soft scratch of quills, the occasional sigh of a monk miswriting glory as globby, and the polite rustle of another getting up, likely to pray, stretch, or find out who took the best goose feather nib again. Standard fonts did not exist. To do calligraphy properly meant training your hands to perform the same looped motions every day until each letter resembled the others, like a family of 22 second cousins in identical habits. Tables were angled, parchment was weighted with stones, and focus was absolute. Even whispers were considered extravagant. Occasionally, a mouse might wander across the desk. This was not entirely unwelcome. Some monks allowed critters into the margins of their work, quite deliberately, sketching mice fighting knights or riding snails. Why snails? No one knows. Perhaps it was a metaphor for the slow pace of monastic life, or perhaps some monks just had a delightful sense of the absurd. Mistakes happened, and when they did, correction wasn't as simple as Ctrl Z. A scrape of the blade would remove the offending letter, a dab of egg white might seal the fix, and then the tiny words were gently rewritten with all the precision of an apologetic feather. There were, of course, no copyright laws, no royalties, and no fan mail. But every book was imbued with a quiet pride. Books were rare and precious, often taking months or years to complete. And behind each one was some unseen, hunched figure in wool, praising the Lord one letter at a time. Illuminated manuscripts weren't merely records of faith. They were the literary lullabies of their age, drifting down centuries later, still holding their mysterious beauty under glass in museums far from the humming scriptoria of old. So if you ever wondered how a Benedictine monk might spend a rainy Tuesday in the year 1234, the answer is probably bent over a Bible, dipping a quill into rust-coloured ink and trying to draw a decent-looking cherub without getting gold leaf stuck to his eyebrows. And just as those sleepy serifs curled across the parchment like a winding path towards something sacred, we too slip quietly onward, making our way to another corner of monastic life, where the bell tolls not for drama, but for laundry. Yes, it's time to fold our curiosity, like a clean habit, and wander into the next surprisingly peaceful pursuit. Chapter 20. The Monastic Garden, where lettuce met contemplation. In the hush of the medieval monastery, amid chants, candle wax, and the occasional unenthusiastic hymn about sin, there bloomed a patch of green so tidy, so reverent, that even the snails felt a bit guilty munching its leaves. This, dear dreamer, was the monastic garden, a holy sanctuary of root vegetables and divine compost. Now, at first glance, a garden may not whisper secrets of the universe, but in the 12th century, a well-weeded patch of leeks was a spiritual and scientific marvel. To a monk with muddy boots and a prayerful brow, the garden was not just soil, it was salvation with celery. These gardens were usually nestled just beyond the cloisters, where square walkways formed a courtyard of quiet reflection. In the centre, order. Rows of herbs, vegetables, and healing plants, grown more precisely than any nobleman's moustache, and with about 94% fewer battle axes. Little paths meandered between the rows, allowing monks to tend their green children with quiet devotion and the occasional muttered verse about cabbage. You see, food wasn't just food. It was fuel for Gregorian chanting and the copying of very long texts about sin. A good monastery grew what it needed: onions for flavouring both stew and sin, carrots to help the brethren see the light, or at least not trip in the nave, and beans, which were probably discussed with silent disapproval due to certain side effects in a closed community. But the true treasures of the monastic garden were the herbs. Lavender for calming minds and possibly masking the enthusiastic smells of wool robes. Rosemary for sharpening memory, ideal for reciting psalms from heart. And sage, well, for wisdom, obviously. The herbal segues didn't stop there. There was feverfew for headaches, tansy for keeping bugs at bay, and mint, which was as refreshing to the palate as it was to the evening prayers. These plants weren't merely medicinal. They were spiritual co-laborers, grown with piety and plucked with purpose. And who was the keeper of this green wisdom? Why, the Hortulanus or Tree Tessera. Of course, a title bestowed upon the monk assigned to garden duties. Think of him as a medieval gardener with a vow of silence and an aggressive stance on weeds. Brother Thomas, let's say, was an excellent Hortulanus. He never spoke unless completely necessary, meaning only when the lettuce wilted or someone stepped on the thyme. He respected the soil as sacred, turning compost like it was a liturgical rhythm, and talking to his marjoram in Latin. But gardens weren't only cultivated, they were contemplated. Monks strolled the paths after matins, soaking in the sun's gentle sermon. The garden was a place of connection between earth and heaven, where pulling turnips brought a man closer to humility, and discovering a wayward beet might prompt a full theological reflection on divine surprise. Seasons, of course, governed everything. Spring was a time of planting, earnest digging and whispered prayers for rain. Summer was maintenance, where the weeds plotted rebellion and the nettles enforced their sting theology. Autumn was harvest, grateful, abundant, and slightly frantic. And winter, oh, winter was for preserves, pickles, and prayer, and absolutely no stepping outdoors unless one fancied frostbite on holy toes. Even winter gardens existed, tending hardy greens and cabbages that could face January like tiny, leafy warriors. Monks preserved apples in cold storage, digging holes lined with straw and spoken hope. Then there were orchards adjacent to the gardens, rows of pear, plum, and apple trees, their gnarled trunks whispering century-old wisdom to anyone slow enough to stand and listen. The apples weren't perfect, no. They bruised easily, like egos when someone messed up the Psalter chant, but they were treasured nonetheless. Gardening tools were humble: a reclaimed stick, a heavy hoe, a bucket made of wood and prayer. Yet these were instruments of sanctity. To garden as a monk was not just to feed the body, but to tend the soul, very slowly and preferably while singing silently. And so, beneath the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional crow's interruption, the monastic garden flourished as a silent sermon in green, a place where lettuce met contemplation, and cabbages were cultivated in the cradle of peace. Now let us gently step away from Brother Thomas and his perfectly aligned parsnip rows, and drift softly toward the kitchen, where the fruits of his labours were transformed ever so blandly into dinner. For what could be more comforting than a monastic stew? Let's quietly make our way into the warm, smoky halls of the medieval monastery kitchen. Chapter 21. The Grand Silence and the Humble Hiccups. When the stars blinked open in the velvet dome of night, and the suspended breath of the monastery hung heavy in the stillness, the monks entered what they called the Great Silence. Sounds rather dramatic, doesn't it? As if doors were sealed with ancient incantations, and no one was permitted even a whispered thought. But in practice, the Great Silence was more of a very polite, extremely extended shh. It began at dusk, not long after the final prayers of Compline echoed quietly through stone corridors. From that moment until after breakfast the next morning, no monk was to speak unless absolutely necessary. Emergencies did count, say, if a fire broke out, or Brother Thomas had one too many barley loaves and required divine intervention via burping. But for the most part, they kept their tongues still. Imagine an entire castle of people stealthily gliding by like robed ghosts, occasionally clearing their throats or accidentally stubbing a toe into a wooden bench with silent dignity. The monasteries were not haunted, they were just very, very quiet. Now, you might be wondering what kind of emergencies prevailed that couldn't wait until sunrise. Well, once, in the Abbey of St. Cuthbert in the Damp, the Great Silence was broken when a stray goat wandered into the scriptorium and made elaborate, if arguably artistic, additions to a half-finished manuscript. Brother Edmund risked eternal shame and a smudged vellum to alert the others, whisper shouting, "Intruder," which was quite dramatic before it became clear it was merely Agnes the goat. Aside from livestock invasions, the Great Silence was generally honoured with deep devotion. But human nature being what it is, particularly sleep-deprived, cabbage-fed human nature. It wasn't always perfect. Hiccups, sneezes, and that raspy sound one makes when inhaling a crumb, it all technically counted as noise. So, monks developed elegant, almost balletic ways of communicating without words. Pointing was considered too crude. Instead, monks used a highly choreographed set of hand gestures, like a holy form of mime. There were signs for bread, water, book, ink, and, surprisingly, more butter, please. One can only imagine the theological ferocity behind a well-placed mime suggesting the butter crock be passed. Hands fluttered gracefully at long wooden tables like medieval butterflies, asking, answering, thanking, and occasionally accusing. The gesture for Brother Osric took 2 eggs was particularly pointed. Yet even amidst all that restraint, the silence became its own kind of sound, a hush so thick it felt cozy, less oppressive, more like a woolen blanket for the ears. For the modern imagination, it's almost unthinkably serene. No phones, no emails, just candlelight, parchment rustling, and the occasional Benedictine burp muffled politely into a sleeve. Some monks learned to love the silence so much they took vows of it beyond the designated hours. One notable example being Brother Ludo of Wessex, who kept a vow of total silence for 11 years, until one perilous day when a bee flew directly into his ear canal, and he reportedly shouted, "Good heavens," thereby ending his streak. He was forgiven, of course, though the bee was never apprehended. This period of quiet wasn't just for piety, it was restful, meditative, restorative. In today's terms, the monastery's nightly silence would be branded as a kind of medieval wellness trend. Monkcore minimalism with a whisper of sacred acoustics. And for those who slipped up, there were humble consequences. A whispered confession to the abbot, a bit of extra dishwashing, or, less egregiously, a mild frown from Brother Crispin, whose disapproval was more bruising than the roughest scourge. But overall, the great silence wasn't dreaded. It was a nightly return to simplicity, a way for the monks to listen, to God, to the wind, and perhaps most urgently, to their own thoughts, which after a day of copywork and turnip stew, tended to be decidedly slow and sleepy, just the way they preferred it. And so, nestled beneath woolen blankets, the monks drifted off, knowing that in the morning, the grand chorus of the divine would start again, with bells, prayers, and experimental porridge. But that, dear dreamer, is a tale for another moonlit hour. Chapter 22 of Scrolls, Scribbles, and the Supreme Art of Not Ruining Everything by Sneezing. The scriptorium, a peaceful, ink-stained sanctuary where parchment dreams were carefully hand-cranked into being, one letter at a time. It was the humming heart of the medieval monastery. Well, more of a whispering heart, really. Humming would have been far too loud and much too enthusiastic for the Benedictine standards of decorum. Let us tiptoe now into this most delicate of chambers, where quiet ruled with an iron feather, and every page held potential for both divine revelation and catastrophic ink spill. Here, monks hunched over desks with the determined serenity of tired cats in sunbeams. They had one duty: copy texts, meticulously, without error, and ideally, without dribbling dinner onto the delicate margins. The texts ranged from holy scripture to herbal recipes, beastly bestiaries, to slightly exaggerated travel guides claiming dragons could be bribed with cheese. The scriptorium was lit by narrow windows and tall expectations. The windows let in just enough daylight to see what one was writing, but not so much that it teased the parchments into curling. Too much light and the pages would ripple like a nervous noble at tax time. Too little light and mistakes happened. And when those mistakes occurred, like turning blessed into blistered, they had to be scraped away with a tiny knife called a penknife. Yes, the original backspace key was sharp and required excellent aim. The copyist monk, or scribe, worked with quills cut from goose feathers, ink concocted from soot, sap, and sometimes old wine, which explains the occasional wobbly gospel, and parchment stretched from sheep or calfskin. Truly a team effort between monk and livestock, though the sheep rarely got credit. Now, life in the scriptorium may sound serene, but it came with hazards subtle and strange. There was the ever-present danger of falling asleep mid-scroll, resulting in a large inky blot right in the middle of the word heaven. Not ideal, theologically speaking. Or sneezing during a particularly ornate capital letter. Some Gothic G's were known to take 40 minutes to embellish. One poorly timed achoo, and it was back to square one. Or perhaps a remorseful prayer for patience. The real champions of this monastic microcosm were the illuminators. These were the artists who took the blank margins and adorned them with vines, saints, demons playing bagpipes, or disaffected rabbits wielding swords. We promise we're not making that one up. Medieval margins were wild. Such marginalia had no official purpose other than delight, which allowed monks a secret outlet for irreverence. Brother Thierry, for instance, once illustrated an entire page by replacing the initial letters of each paragraph with tiny unicorns. The abbot disapproved, privately, then requested a unicorn bookmark for his own psalter. Hypocrisy was rarely as whimsical. Sometimes monks would leave little notes at the end of manuscripts, in Latin of course, but essentially saying things like, "Thank heavens, it's finished," or "My hand is cramped and I desire soup." These tiny laments connect us across centuries, reminding us that even in the holiest of offices, people remain charmingly human. Say what you will, but scribes were the original bloggers, silent observers with aching wrists and a niche readership. Of course, not all texts were purely noble. Some monks copied risque Roman poetry, while others curated herbal manuals detailing when to pick fennel under a waxing moon to ward off stomach grief, love spells, or demons with poor social etiquette. Monastic libraries, though closed to most of the outside world, were open cosmos inside, each scroll a star, each book a planet in a universe of ink. Time moved differently in the scriptorium. Pages turned slowly, like autumn leaves drifting on a still pond. Monks measured progress not in chapters or deadlines, but in pages completed with care. The quiet repetition of letters formed a ritual of its own, a devotion laid not before an altar, but woven into the syllables of sacred texts and the margins filled with sleepy dragons. And when the day's work was done, the quills washed and set to dry like feathered spoons, the parchment stacked neatly under polished stones, and the candles snuffed one by one, the silence of the scriptorium deepened, as if even the very air paused with reverence. For where one monk wrote, another would one day read, and perhaps wonder why there was a doodle of a snail jousting a knight halfway through the book of Luke. Let us now leave Brother Olwyn, squinting at a smudged letter R, and wondering whether to fix it or pass it off as divine mystery. Somewhere, in another corner of the monastery, a bell is calling the brethren to compline prayers, and the ink has cooled for the evening. In the hush that follows, we'll drift next into the curious world of monastic gardens, where even the weeds had names, and sometimes feelings. Chapter 23. the sacred snail race, and other leisurely pursuits. Now, as the candlelight flickers low and shadows stretch sleepy limbs across cloister walls, let us tiptoe into one of the least urgent, yet most tenderly peculiar themes of monastic life: recreation. Yes, dear dreamer, the monks had free time. Not much, but just enough for mildly spirited pastimes. Forget sports cars and rugby scrums. Medieval monks lived in a world where excitement came in the form of illuminated manuscripts, ecclesiastical riddles, and the occasional theological jest that could toast an entire scriptorium in laughter, a polite, silent, no-snort kind of laughter. But even in their hushed, contemplative world, relaxation had its place. Imagine Brother Elred, a Benedictine with stiff knees and a secret passion for carving walnut chess pieces in the likeness of saints with overly noble chins. If you were to ask, which you wouldn't, because that would require speaking during leisure hour, he would swear that St. Cuthbert was best played as a queen, versatile and cool-headed. Within the rule of St. Benedict, the Spiritual Operations Manual of Monkhood, leisure was not entirely forgotten. Monks were advised to balance their labours of the soul and soil with renewal of the body and conviviality. Not too much, mind you, no swinging from the rafters, but perhaps a gentle game of draughts, or for the true wild ones, knitting competitions. Gardening was technically labour, but oh, how tenderly it mingled with delight. Brother Oswin sang Gregorian tunes to his cabbages and swore it made them crisper. Brother Humphrey turned carrot cultivars into friendly court intrigue, crowning one unusually orange specimen Sir Ruticus the Bold. Then there were the scriptorium breaks. Picture a room dimly lit, ink pots lined like obedient ducklings, and a single sneeze risking the smearing of a week's worth of psalms. During pause for walks, monks strolled the cloister walkways, occasionally bending over in profound theological contemplation, or perhaps simply to tie a stubborn sandal lace. But perhaps the most curious recreational phenomenon involved tiny, slow-moving creatures beloved by marginalia artists and deeply feared by lettuce gardeners, snails. In the glittering borders of illuminated manuscripts, tiny armoured gastropods squared off with knights, hermits, and once, in a particularly avant-garde Book of Hours, with what appeared to be a sentient thimble. Why so many snails? Scholars still scratch their heads, but some believe it was a slow-motion satire of earthly struggle. The endless, absurd battle against forces wildly beneath or above our concern. It is also vaguely possible that in some monasteries, the monks held snail races. And though there is no hard proof, we choose to believe that Brother Godwin once whispered encouragement to a particularly feisty Roman snail named Seraphina the Slippery, while others cheered in their own dignified way, clapping with precisely 2 fingers. Music, too, wove its tranquil threads through monastic life. Not the lute-thrashing minstrels of tavern tales, but soft chant, meandering and meditative. On rare leisure evenings, a few monks might gather in the warming room for a non-liturgical sing-along, a Gregorian jam session, if you will. Brother Cedric's rendition of Alleluia was said to make the sparrows nest more deeply in the eaves. Despite the strictness of their schedules, monks found comfort in lilting joy, in beeswax jokes, in rearranging library scrolls by the first letter of their favourite saint's name, and in marvelling at how Brother Wilfrid's sandals always squeaked like disapproving mice during compline prayers. Such gentle amusements held no medals or accolades, but offered consolation to souls weathered by fasting, silence, and the eternal mysteries of irrigation trenches. You see, Even in one of history's most restrained lifestyles, the human spirit, that irrepressible desire to chuckle softly and carve a chess bishop with one exaggerated eyebrow, found its way through. The monastic ideal, it seems, wasn't to eliminate joy, but to slow it to a crawl, like Seraphina in the cloister corridor, inching nobly forth, accompanied by a chorus of faint two-finger claps. And so, as the monastery's final bell rings near and the kettle cools beside the hearth, we snuff the taper and draw the shadows close. One more truth remains to be whispered, a final thread to be sewn into this peaceful patchwork. Let us drift toward it gently, in the still hush of night. Chapter 24. Vespers, vapors, and very modest goodbyes. The sun slips beneath the horizon like a candle under heavy velvet, and in the quiet cloisters of medieval Europe, our monks begin the final act of their well-ordered day. Vespers, the evening prayer, whispers long Latin syllables into the dimming stone walls, each note floating softly upward, like the steam from a warm bowl of lentil pottage. Candles flicker, sandals shuffle, and somewhere in the back of the chapel, Brother Oswin pretends to follow along, but has, in fact, dozed off mid-Amen. A gentle snore escapes his lips, accented by a twitch that might be repentance, or perhaps just a rather stubborn itch behind the ear. The day is winding down now. The manuscript pages have all been turned. The bees in the abbey's humble apiary have buzzed their last for the evening. Even the garden's carrots, tidy and righteous in their rows, seem to lean slightly under the weight of sleep. The monks retire to their cells, tiny, humble rooms better suited to hermits or contemplative introspection than to, say, bouncing on the mattress, not least because the mattress is usually a loosely stuffed sack of straw, and the bouncing would result in hay in several regrettable places. Now, you may imagine that monks, stoic, solemn, and serenely silent, would have no particular nighttime rituals. But oh, how wrong you'd be. Even the devout get chilly. Before Compline, the final prayer office, monks often swaddle themselves in their woolen habits and mutter small complaints about the draftiness of 13th century architecture. And rather than assume they floated off into sleepy niente like candle smoke, let us peek once more into the modest bedtime goings-on of a faithful friar. Brother Cedric, for example, always lined up his sandals precisely beneath his cot. A tiny ritual, a holy geometry. Left sandal, right sandal, every single night. Not because anyone told him to, but because after years of quiet discipline, the habit had become, well, a habit. So too with taking exactly 9 chews of his oatcake, whispering a short appeal to Saint Apollonia, patroness of teeth, just in case, and exhaling deeply through his nose like a man who once almost sneezed in chapel and never quite forgave himself. By candlelight, some monks might read, although, plot twist, most could not. Literacy wasn't guaranteed, even among the cloistered. Those who could decipher Latin enjoyed leafing through Psalters, Lives of the Saints, or, if feeling particularly cheeky, theological treatises that made the devil look like he was trying very hard on a bad day. And just as we all replay the events of the day in the quiet moments before sleep, so too did medieval monks. But instead of fretting over unanswered emails or grocery lists, our monastic dreamers might ponder whether their bean plot had enough manure, or whether they'd been too prideful during the Psalms, or, for the particularly contemplative, whether angels truly preferred incense made from frankincense or myrrh, or if they weren't so much picky as just being polite. Eventually, the abbey falls into a hush thick enough to spread on toast. Outside, owls resume their ghostly liturgy. A chill wind twists through the cloister, rearranging a few fallen leaves and carrying distant bells from another priory, lazy and lopsided in the slap of night. Inside, our monks nestle into their prickly straw cots. There is no tossing and turning, not because monks don't get restless, but because tossing and turning tends to be audible in thin-walled dormitories and is discouraged in the rule of St. Benedict, right after "don't grumble about the abbot." So they lie still, they breathe, they dream very humble, very chaste dreams, possibly about cheese. The world of the monastery becomes a breath held in darkness. Time steps lightly now, like a cat on cold stone, careful not to wake the prayers asleep within the walls. And so we leave them here, shrouded in wool, wrapped in ritual, kissed by candlelight. The bells are stilled, the ink is dry, and somewhere Brother Oswin finally awakens just long enough to mumble his final prayer, a muffled, sleep-drenched petition that tomorrow's morning porridge not be quite so lumpy. History can be harsh and loud, of course, but tonight it is soft, gentle as linen robes, and quieter than a quill upon vellum. Sleep now, curious soul. The monks keep their vigil, and the night watches over you.